Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, January 3rd, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the impact of Donald Trump's leaked tape call with Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Republican Secretary of State, and we're going to be discussing the impact of it on the 2020 Senate elections, actually 2021 Senate elections in the state of Georgia, because there is absolutely no way that this turns out to be positive for Donald Trump or the Republican Party. This couldn't have dropped at a more inconvenient time. Looking at the runoff elections that are set to occur in just 2 days, not even 48 hours before the polls open, and this tape essentially tells us that Donald Trump has asked Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State, to quote-unquote find votes to count in the state of Georgia. This is an hour-long conversation that you can find on the Washington Post for the entire transcript. There are very alarming parts, but the most important part is when Donald Trump explicitly asked Brad Raffensperger to find 11,780 votes. Why that number? Joe Biden won the state by 11,779 votes, so he wants just one more to actually put him over the top. In fact, he mentions to Raffensperger that no one would bat an eye if he says that Georgia recalculated the votes and found all of a sudden Trump votes, and Trump pretty much excused this, going back and forth with Brad Raffensperger that Trump says he won the state and therefore these votes should be counted, that Republican votes were being shredded in Fulton County and counties around the state, supposedly based off rumors he's heard. Looking at the entire transcript itself, there's absolutely no part where Donald Trump really could try to take this and say he was misinterpreted, because on many accounts he argued with Brad Raffensperger saying that the election was rigged. And also, Donald Trump, for whatever reason, tweeted about this situation, this call actually, and once this was released, it completely went against everything that Donald Trump said. And, Donald Trump essentially was telling Brad Raffensperger that the election in Georgia was not fair. He was saying that everything that occurred was not favoring him the way that it should have, that he somehow won the state by hundreds of thousands of votes. And we all know that isn't true. And you can only imagine that if you are a voter who voted for McCain, who voted for Romney, who voted for Trump in 2016, but then moved over to Joe Biden, if you're being told that your vote was illegitimate, that your election victory, the person you voted for, should not have won the election because the president of the United States heard rumors, that is not something that will help candidates that are being directly endorsed and directly associated with these candidates. And I'm not the only one who's arriving at this conclusion. I put everything on halt once this this transcript and this audio recording came out, because you can hear explicitly from Donald Trump's words that nobody would question if Georgia recalculated the votes, that he explicitly asked, here actually is the quote, "All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state." And if you're looking at the victory margin for Joe Biden, the 11,780, like I mentioned before, would put Donald Trump one vote over Joe Biden in the state. So he's essentially trying to ask Brad Raffensperger to actually find these votes, and it gets even worse. He mentions that what Brad Raffensperger was doing was illegal, that it was a felony. It was a crime for him to allow this election to proceed, for him to allow the election results to be certified. Because according to Donald Trump, the election results were rigged. The election results were invalid. The election results should not be counted. And Georgia, according to Donald Trump, went to him by hundreds of thousands of votes. But obviously, there is no evidence to back that up whatsoever. So this tape essentially is Donald Trump just asking the Republican Secretary of State. He even mentions that he is a Republican, I guess in a way to try to sway him that he should be siding with the National Party here. But essentially, what he was telling him was that, what he was doing was supposedly illegal. And it came across very similar to a threat, which is why this could not have been something that will help the Georgia GOP whatsoever, because they are already at a point where they could possibly lose the Georgia elections. The approval rating of Donald Trump is 2 points lower than where it was on Election Day, which means if he didn't win it then, you can't imagine he'd have an easier job at electing Republicans now. But the benefit for the Republicans there is that Donald Trump isn't the one at the top of the ticket. It's just going to be 2 Senate races. But if these are candidates that are clinging on to just the Trump base to try to win the state of Georgia, it may not be the easiest thing possible. And Predict It is actually acknowledging this as well. I'm not the only one who thinks that these tapes are fundamentally shifting the way the race could actually go. We had talked about the entire election cycle for these runoff races that the Republican Party was going to be in the advantage. But right now, Predict It actually gives the Democratic Party both Senate seats. This has never happened after the election. Not once. When I made my video yesterday talking about the flip in the predicted market, it was notable because the special election had flipped in favor of the Democrats. But now Jon Ossoff has taken the lead over David Perdue in this race, and the Democratic Party has gotten a lot closer to the Senate majority. Because not only was Donald Trump asking for a Republican Secretary of State to find votes that do not exist, essentially asking him to try to subvert the election process, we knew he didn't accept the results, but this is a way more extreme scenario. This is him essentially asking on recording. You can hear him. It's very similar to the Access Hollywood tape, except this time there won't be a James Comey reopening of the email investigation to bail him out. That won't happen. This recording is something that will probably end up dooming David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler. And had it come out just a few days earlier, it's possible the GOP could have recovered, but there's less than 48 hours until these polls open. Less than 48 hours until these polls open on Tuesday. And I can't imagine this is something that would fly too well amongst the traditional family values type of Republican Party that's prominent in Georgia. Donald Trump's Republican Party is not the Republican Party of Georgia. Yes, the statewide officials may have been swooped in and may have been more obliged to support President Trump, but the governor there is standing firm on the election results. The Secretary of State is standing firm on the election results. And his pressure, him trying to essentially correlate just being a regular Secretary of State who believes that the election process was fair to somehow being criminal behavior, is something that will absolutely not play well amongst voters that already rejected Donald Trump on the first ballot. They already told America that they wanted Joe Biden to be the next president of the United States. That is a fact. Georgia was won by Joe Biden. And if you're in a state that you lost and you're trying to tell people that this win was illegitimate and trying to tell people that, or trying to tell the Republican officials here to overturn the election results, if they didn't like you before, they absolutely don't now. And there are plenty of voters who actually voted for Joe Biden that ended up voting for David Perdue. But after this tape, if David Perdue, which he still has, I mean, you can't really not associate David Perdue with these Senate Republicans. He's going to be there. Actually, Donald Trump's going to be there tomorrow night, Monday night, campaigning for them. We don't know if that will actually hold up. But David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler are so closely associated with Donald Trump because they've had to stick by him through everything that's occurred. They've had to stick by him through the failed court cases, through the failed state legislature calls, through the failed governor calls, specifically in Georgia. He's essentially pushed them to try to indirectly call on the resignation of Brad Raffensperger or the resignation of Brian Kemp in the states. And because they are so closely associated with him, this is only going to drag them down. This is only going to drag them down to a point where we could actually see the Democratic Party win here. Things are lining up for the Democratic Party. In order for them to win in Georgia, I had mentioned this before, they needed a perfect storm. They needed everything to work together in their favor. They needed everything to come down. They needed the approval rating of Trump to drop. It did. They needed the early voting numbers to favor them better. It did. Now they have a scandal at hand, and I know we hear about scandals all the time with the Trump administration, but here we have on recording, and recordings are one of the few things that have actually hurt Donald Trump extremely. Looking at the recordings, Donald Trump is asking the Georgia Republican Secretary of State to change the election results, telling him that the election was illegitimate, going back and forth for an hour, arguing that what Brad Raffensperger is doing is illegal. All 49 other Secretary of States have done exactly what he did, certify the election results because there was no found voter fraud on a widespread level. The only voter fraud that was somewhat notable was in Pennsylvania. 3 cases of voter fraud, all of which voted for Donald Trump, illegally. So when you're looking at Georgia itself, there was no significant amounts of voter fraud, none at all, really. And if you're looking at Brad Raffensperger, he has every reason to side with President Trump on this, except he has a duty to his state first. He has a duty to his constituents first. His job is to uphold the election process, to hold a free and fair election. And that's what happened in Georgia. That's what happened in the 49 other states, including the District of Columbia. Every state was held in a fair and respected manner. Every state. And for Donald Trump to try to ask Brad Raffensperger to get 11,780 more votes added to him, which would just put him 1 vote over the top, seems very corrupt. And in the eyes of the average Georgia voter, I can't imagine that the Republican Party can do enough damage control to try to recover this close to the election. It may seem very similar to the Access Hollywood tape. And you might be thinking, will this hurt the GOP as much as you'd think? These candidates aren't Donald Trump. But if they have him out tomorrow night, I can't see any scenario in which they win if they do that. I really don't, because this is something that is probably going to irk plenty of traditional Republicans that are now seeing Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue so closely associated with President Trump. If they think Trump is corrupt, maybe they just didn't like him before. They didn't like the fact that he was against Romney, against McCain, that he didn't stand for the traditional, GOP. They didn't like the new GOP. But they liked Kelly Loeffler, they liked David Perdue, or at least they liked Doug Collins maybe in the special election, but they liked traditional Republicans that were brought in during the Romney era, or Republicans that have had a long history of being more traditional conservative. Kelly Loeffler definitely has taken the more pro-Trump path, but she was also on the same ballot as David Perdue. But I think Trump is tainting their names. I think Trump is hurting the GOP's chances in Georgia. Without Donald Trump, if he immediately conceded the election results, Georgia would be lean, possibly likely, for the Republican Party, because there would be, the call on for there to be a check on a President-elect Biden. But because the Republican Party has not acknowledged Joe Biden's victory, they can't use that as an argument. They cannot use that as an argument. You can't say there should be a check on the president when the president is supposedly going to be your own political party. Calling on a check on a president is one of the most effective campaign strategies that we've seen in America. Look at every midterm election. Even if people, and the majority of people, weren't exactly Republican or Democratic voters, they may vote for the opposition party just to keep the incumbent president in check. There's no reason, besides keeping a check on the president, that Obama should have went from a Senate with a 59-41 majority, a 60-40 seat majority at some points, with over 250 seats in the House for the Democrats, to bringing them down to 180 seats. That should not have happened. Or 190 seats. That should not have happened. Actually, below 190. That should not have happened. If we were talking about a normal type of election, a 63-seat change only occurs when there's a firm support for an opposition party, usually to keep the president in check, because just 2 years later, they reelected President Obama. So when I'm looking at these calls in previous elections to check on the president, especially after a presidential election, they usually work. But the GOP does not have that this time. They've been sticking by President Trump very closely, and they don't allow the people that they're campaigning with to even refer to Joe Biden as President-elect Biden. The two senators have not acknowledged Joe Biden's election victory. And I know that may seem normal now, but that was absolutely not the norm, ever. And if you're looking at the state of Georgia right now, it's not a Trump state. You can't argue that Donald Trump is somehow going to help the GOP if he already lost the state. He could be bringing out their base, but that would only benefit the Republican Party if turnout was decreased. Turnout is 75% of what it was in 2020 based off the early vote. That's extremely high. In a runoff election that's held right through the holiday season, it shouldn't be this high. The turnout levels should not be this high, but they are, because there is so much at stake. And things are only starting to stack up against the Republican Party. Donald Trump's tapes, the approval rating dipping, the polling numbers dipping for the GOP, the fundraising advantage for the Democratic Party, the early voting numbers favoring Democrats more so than they did in 2020 regular election. There are just so many things that, when you're looking at the numbers, you can't form a conclusion that the Republican Party seems to be gaining ground, seems to be doing better than they were a month ago. I had always said the Republican Party was going to be the party that I thought was going to win the Georgia runoff elections. And that's because it should have been. Runoff elections historically have never benefited the Democratic Party in any Georgia election, except for 1998. That was the last time the Democratic Party did better in a runoff election compared to the actual election results. So you can see how far ago that was. Keep in mind, though, the last time a Democrat won Georgia on the presidential level was 1992. So maybe this year will be a difference, breaking something that was done in the 90s but never done again in the 21st century. That could possibly happen. The Democrats could actually win both Senate races. They have a very good chance, especially following these tapes being released. This is a huge game changer. If the Republican Party was scared about Georgia before, I can't imagine how much more scared they are right now, because this directly impacts Georgia voters. This is a huge slap in the face to more traditional, more moderate Republicans who were iffy about Trump, but all on board with David Perdue and maybe Doug Collins or Kelly Loeffler. They may no longer be fully on board with David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler as they cling to Donald Trump as their last-ditch effort to win the election. These are races that were the Republican parties to lose. But it looks as if the Democratic Party may actually edge them out in this one. But also, so many things are uncertain. This election is very, very weird. I will update you guys on my final rating, probably the morning of the runoff elections, just because that's when I'll be able to fully analyze everything. But when you're looking at everything that's been piling up, the momentum is clearly on the Democratic Party side. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my post-2020 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.